Had talked about dignity, something that a number of groups had come up with by way of an answer for the grounding feature of human rights. And my criticism of that was not necessarily that it's mistaken, but rather that the notion of dignity is too vague, or as Kit would probably prefer to put it, too indeterminate to do much work by way of justifying human rights. And in particular, it fails to give us any kind of specific criterion that we can use to determine whether someone has human rights or does not have human rights. So I then considered other criteria or other grounding features, such as biology and autonomy. The good thing about using biology, being a member of the human species, to serve as a basis of having human rights is that even babies can have human rights. And many people thought that not only did babies have human rights, that it was obvious that they had human rights. And if that's so, then biology will do a good job there of serving as the grounding feature. The problem, though, is that in other contexts, it's rarely, if ever, the case that biology is really morally important. What seems to be morally important about our biology is that our biology allows us to possess other features, features like consciousness and autonomy. So we considered autonomy, which is Kant's own preferred basis for human rights, autonomy and rationality. I should have added rationality to this list. I'm sorry, that belongs there as well. And although autonomy and rationality are good candidates, I think, for serving as the basis of human rights, the problem is that they will not allow us to assign human rights to babies, because babies are neither autonomous nor rational. We briefly considered the possibility of consciousness, which includes the ability to experience suffering and enjoyment. And a benefit of thinking of consciousness as the grounding feature of human rights is that babies are conscious. And so babies could qualify as having human rights. The problem, however, is that animals are also conscious, and we presumably do not want to extend human rights to animals. So that leaves us with at least two other possibilities, and maybe more possibilities, depending on whether you want to add to the list for purposes of our discussion. So one possibility I'll mention here, which I didn't mention at all yesterday, is what I call reciprocity. Could you just do a... Okay. Reciprocity. And this feature is favored by Thomas Hobbes and contemporary Hobbesians like David Gautier or Jan Narveson. Are these names that anyone is familiar with?
Which one? Gautier.
Gautier. David Gautier and Jan Narveson. These are very prominent political philosophers who defend a version of Hobbes's view about human rights, or a Hobbesian view of human rights. And what I mean by reciprocity is this. Those who are eligible to have any rights, whether they're human rights or just general moral rights and legal rights, according to Thomas Hobbes, are those who are members of the social contract. And you have to have a very special feature in order to be a member of the social contract. You have to be someone who is capable of reciprocating benefits and threats of harm. In other words, in order to be a member of the social contract, according to Hobbes, you have to be someone who has the potential to harm me, and from whom I have the potential to benefit. You are my potential threat, and you are my potential benefactor. What's the word for benefactor? Okay. So if you cannot threaten me, if you cannot benefit me, then there is no reason for me to enter into a contract with you. Because when we enter a social contract with one another, one thing that we do, perhaps the most important thing we do, is we give up some liberty, some freedom. When you enter a social contract, you say, I will no longer be at liberty. I will no longer be free to take from you whatever I can, to kill you if I want to double-cross you, to break my promises to you. I will abandon all of those freedoms. Now, why would I give up my freedom, since freedom is such a good thing? The answer for Hobbes is, I will give up my freedom, and it is rational for me to give up my freedom only if I will benefit as a result. But how can I benefit from you? Only if you pose a threat to me, and if in giving up my liberty, I increase my chance of gaining a benefit from you. And that benefit is, I am no longer under threat from you. You will no longer threaten to deprive me of what is mine. Okay. So from this social contract view of rights and the foundation of justice, the idea is that you are eligible to have rights only if you are what I will call a reciprocator, someone who stands in that relationship that I just described, namely someone who is a potential benefactor and a potential threat. And so, animals are not parties to the social contract, and therefore animals have no rights. Trees and the environment is not party to the social contract. Why? Because I can take whatever I want from an animal or from a plant, and I don't have to give up any liberty in return. They're not threatening me. I can get whatever I want from them, and therefore I have no reason to enter a contract with them. And therefore there are no relations of justice between me and an animal, or me and a plant. But also, there are no relations of justice between me and a baby. Because whatever I want from a baby, I can take. The baby is no threat to me. If I want any sort of benefit from that baby, to the extent that a baby can give me a benefit, I can just take it. And so a baby is not party to the social contract either, and therefore, on this understanding of where our rights come from, babies have no rights either. The last thing, I wish Dima were here because he's the one who encouraged me to talk about this, is the thought that what serves as the basis of our human rights is a soul. He said a lot of people here have religious beliefs, and they think that a soul serves as the grounding feature of having human rights. Now, we could spend the next 3 hours talking about this, but we're not going to. I'm not going to try to talk about religious beliefs, really. But what I want to say is this. I think that we can talk about a soul in non-religious terms. If you think that the reason we have rights is because God has given us these rights, there's really nothing much to say. There's not much of a discussion to have at that point. Many people don't believe in God. Many people believe in God but don't believe in a soul. I actually do believe in a soul, but I think that there is a completely non-religious account of a soul, that when you think about what a soul really means, from a religious perspective or a non-religious perspective, I think we should all, but maybe I'll be shown wrong, I think we should all agree that a soul has two defining features. One is that it's immaterial. What's the Russian word for that?
Immaterial.
Okay. It's immaterial. And the other is, it is the individuating feature of each person. What's individuating? Yeah, okay. So that's what a soul does. You can't touch a soul. You can't say, oh, my finger's hurting because my soul is really bothering me. You know, my soul isn't here, right? There's no place you can point and say, oh, there's my soul. Some people sometimes say, my soul. But of course, it's not right behind your breastbone. That's not where your soul is. Your soul isn't located anywhere in like a little box within your body. And your soul is what makes you different from everybody else. I think that there is I think that there is something that serves the role of the soul, and that's called the personality. That's what your soul is. Your soul is your personality. You can't point to your personality. Your personality doesn't exist here or here or here. And your personality is what makes you a distinct person. That's, in English, that's why the word is as it is. Your personality is what makes you a distinct, unique individual. In that case, however, we can say then that everyone has a soul, but two things. And further, we can also say, I think, that babies have souls. I have two children. They're now 18 and 15. They're not little kids anymore. But it seems to me that even at the very beginning, they had a unique personality.
Yes, that's true.
Okay. So far, Hod agrees it must be true. So I think the good thing about speaking about a soul is we don't have to talk about religion. Even non-religious people can agree that people have a soul when understood in this way, as the way I'm understanding a soul. Babies have souls, so they might be eligible to have human rights. But the problem is, there are two problems actually. One is that it also seems that now many animals have souls because animals have personalities. I've had dogs as pets, I've had cats as pets, and they have distinct personalities. And yet we presumably do not want to say of dogs and cats that they have human rights too. Maybe that's I guess the only problem I need to talk about without spending too much time on this. So we have now a nice list here. I should have added rationality to that list as well. We talked about that yesterday. It's a feature that many people identify as the basis of human rights. It will not allow a baby to have human rights, however. So I want to just reiterate the lesson I ended with yesterday, and that is that we don't yet have a very widely accepted basis for determining what the grounding feature is for human rights. Each of the features we've considered has some benefits, but each has some problems. Before we move on to a new part, a new set of discussion topics, I want to invite anybody else to add something to this list for our general discussion. You don't have to, but if there is something you think I have missed, I'd be very happy to discuss it with the group. Does anybody want to add anything? Yes, Sergey?
You see, I see the problem of human rights as a part of a more general problem, the identifying the subject of rights. So we could have some social need or interest or value to assign rights to some subject, to some entity, which could be an entity and subject according to law, but will not have dignity, biology, and so on. Mm-hmm. So we could probably, again, we can, I think, and according to the practice, assign rights, maybe we wouldn't call it human rights, to any entity which exists according to law. So it could be the social value, social interest, and so on.
I completely agree with what you have said. I don't know that that's going to solve this problem because, for instance, as you say, we can assign, say, corporations rights and not say that they are human rights. Mm-hmm. But what I'm trying to figure out is there does seem something special about human rights as a subset of all the rights there are. And the question is whether or not there is some special, if there is a special subset, if we identify human rights as one group among many rights, there should be some common basis, some essence to human rights that explains why they are what they are. And that essence should presumably be explained by some feature on this list.
I understand that, but I see this problem as a part of general problem. So the general criteria could be applied to this problem too. So somebody or any entity or something could not have any of these, according to my position. But somehow, according to some interest, value, or context, we can assign rights to anything.
Okay.
You're talking about dogs and cats, but they're not humans. So by definition, they're not coming into the discussion. But you mentioned it. So I think this is the example, because this is a part of a bigger problem, criteria of definition, defining the subject of rights. So that's my point.
Okay, I agree with it.
But we still need criteria. I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So, anybody want to offer another alternative before we move on?
Maybe free will.
Free will. Oh, okay. Now, free will is.
Autonomy.
Do you distinguish that from autonomy? And so,
Yes.
you do. Okay.
Free will is more substantive. Autonomy is more formal category, isn't it?
Okay. So, how do you understand free will? Who made the suggestion?
Can I explain?
Yeah.
We can have autonomy in some field, for example, in political life or in moral life. But free will, as you say, it's the metaphysical idea, and it's something different from autonomy.
Okay. So, free will. We might. Here's a very basic definition of free will. We have free will when we are able to choose differently from the way we actually choose. Does that sound as a good working definition? Okay. All right. In that case, is there any problem with free will?
Well, you can
Free
choose
will-
whether to abuse someone's rights or not. And if you choose not to, then it may be. But it may embrace the reciprocity as well.
It may. I see one potential problem with free will, and that is it's not clear that babies have free will. Now, babies might be able to act freely to the extent that they can act. Babies might only be able to behave. That is, their bodies move, but their bodily movements are not prompted, motivated by intentions. It seems to me that in order to have free will, we have to have some level of cognitive development. We have to be able to understand the choices in front of us and then to select those choices on some basis or other. And so the babies may be able to freely act, but they might not have free will. That is, it might be that no one is forcing them to act in a certain way, so they are free to act. They are at liberty to act in various ways, but they might not be cognitively developed enough to have free will.
That's a critique. Professor Pochrobniak suggested vulnerability of human vulnerability as a basis
Okay, what kind of vulnerability to what?
to rights, for example.
Okay, that's a possibility. The problem, though, again, is that animals are also vulnerable.
That's true, but that's not exclusive.
Okay, so we're willing to extend human rights to animals then?
Why is it human rights? It's just rights.
Okay.
Well, there are common features that we share with animals, because
That's right.
you can say also that we are animals in some respects, so
That's right.
one does not exclude the other.
Okay. That's okay. That brings us to the last point I'll make about this, and then we'll move on to a different discussion.
May I have a short remark?
Yes.
We aren't looking for unique criteria, aren't we? We can use several criteria. Is that all right?
That's right, sure. That's right. The thing is that so you might be tempted to say, well, no one of these is the criterion, but if we add some together, we might have the right criterion by adding these different criteria. Here's the worry about that, and that is that if there's a problem for each one of these, it's not clear when you add them up that you get rid of the problems. You might just add up the problems, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, all right, maybe we should just leave that there and in an unsettled state, which is perfectly fine because we're doing philosophy. We can't expect in 9 hours of lecture to solve all the problems of human rights. Now what I would like to do instead is to ask a set of different questions, and what I want you to do while I'm writing these questions on the board is to get together in the groups that you were in yesterday. What I'd like to do is I would like to have us consider these questions now in order, and I will give my own remarks about them and then invite your observations and your criticisms of them. So, with regard to, I want first of all actually to do a little bit of clarifying. This is what philosophers do, of course, in response to a very good question I got during the break. The question was, well, isn't every inalienable right absolute? Why are we asking these two different questions? Why not just make them one question? Because they seem to be the same question. And I think it's important to see that they are not. I'll try to give you an example that may be compelling, it may not be, to get you to see the difference between these two questions. Whether a right is inalienable is a matter of whether you are able, whether you have the authority to give it away, to waive it, or whether you, through your wrongdoing, through doing wrong, can forfeit it, whether you can lose it that way. Now, it might be the case that there are some inalienable rights. If there are any, my guess is that the right to life is the best candidate for an inalienable right. I might be wrong about that. I'm interested to hear if you think I'm wrong about that. But let's just assume right now that there is an inalienable right to life. Even if it's inalienable, it might not be absolute. Why? It might be that I am unable to waive my right to life. I do not have the authority to waive my right to life. John Locke thought that, for instance. Is everyone familiar with John Locke? Yeah, okay. Personally, yeah. Oh, you go way back. You're much older than you look. So John Locke, for instance, thought that we were unable to waive our right to life. Of course, we could kill ourselves. We could ask somebody to kill us, but we didn't have the moral authority to do that. We were, in fact, unable to waive our right to life, even if we really wanted to. We just couldn't do it because our life was not really ours to decide as to whether we live or die. We are, in effect, God's property. God has the authority over when we live or die. We do not have the moral authority, and so we are not able to waive our right to life. He did think that we could forfeit our right to life. But imagine someone who denies that. Someone who thinks, as Locke does, that we are unable to waive our right to life, but disagrees with Locke and says, further, that we are not able to forfeit our right to life. Even if we murder somebody else, we still have a right to life. Imagine such a person, such a position. Still, even though that right to life under these imagined circumstances is inalienable, it might not be absolute. It might be acceptable, morally acceptable for someone to kill a person, even an innocent person. And the circumstance that always comes up is a circumstance known as the ticking bomb terrorist circumstance. Imagine a terrorist who says that I have planted a bomb in downtown Kiev or downtown Moscow or downtown New York, where thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people will be killed if this bomb goes off. And imagine that you know who this terrorist is, that this terrorist is very credible because he has done a lot of awful things in the past, and the terrorist says this: there's only one way I will tell you where that bomb is. You have to kill Shafer-Landau.
No.
Yes. Whew. Or so, someone else who's innocent. Now, this, of course, is a contrived situation. It's a situation that is fictional, but it could be possible. It's not impossible to imagine a terrorist like this. And so, if you were in that situation, many thinkers believe that although it's a tragic choice, it's a terrible decision to make, and we're not happy to make this choice, morally speaking, the best choice is to kill this innocent person. Now, it's a gamble, right? But life does not present us with guarantees. And what we need to do, the morally responsible thing to do, is to try to minimize the loss of human life. So though every innocent human being has a right to life, and this right to life is furthermore, under these circumstances, inalienable, nevertheless, it is not absolute, because in this, according to many people at least, it is morally permitted. It may even be morally required, but it is at least morally permitted to kill this person. So that would be a case in which the right is not absolute, but is inalienable. Okay. Now, what I've just done is I've just presented a version of the strongest argument against the view that rights are absolute. And what I've done, I've presented this argument, which is strong for two reasons. One is I've picked a first-generation fundamental right, a right to life. I'm not talking about the right to have fun or the right to have a paid holiday. I'm talking about the right to life. And I'm imagining a situation in which, even with regard to this most fundamental right, it is morally permitted to violate it. It's not that you lose your right, you keep it. But nevertheless, it is morally acceptable to violate it. And the reason this is the strongest argument is because what it does is it's a variation or version of what has come to be known as the argument from catastrophe. What's the Russian for catastrophe? Okay. It's the same language, I'm telling you. Okay. You just pronounce it much nicer than I do. Okay. Okay. So the idea is that although rights are important, and this is an idea that came up in many discussions, I heard it from more than one person, human rights are the most important moral consideration. This is what many people believe and what a few of you said just half an hour ago. But what the argument from catastrophe brings to our attention is the possibility that even a human right, such as a right to life, is not the most important consideration in a particular case. Now, this admittedly is a very unusual, extreme case. But sometimes life presents us with emergency situations, with extreme situations. So what I want to do is I just want to invite your comments about whether you believe that the argument from catastrophe is acceptable. The argument, I didn't lay it out in step-by-step fashion, but it's very simple. The argument goes like this. If there are any absolute rights, then it is never morally acceptable to violate them. That principle is true, because the principle follows from the definition of an absolute right. If there are any absolute human rights, then it is never morally acceptable to violate them. That's just what it means for a right to be an absolute right. Then the second premise of this argument says that for any human right, it is in some cases acceptable to violate it. And therefore, there are no absolute human rights. Now, the important philosophical work takes place in premise number 2, the claim that for any human right, there is at least one circumstance where it is acceptable to violate it. Why believe that claim? Why believe the second premise of this argument from catastrophe? for reasons I've just given. Namely, we come up with an example in which the only way to prevent a disaster is by violating someone's human right. And then you have the question, and I open it now to discussion. Is a right so important that in order to respect it, you must allow disaster to occur? This is the strongest challenge to the claim that human rights are absolute. What do you think? Slavic? Excuse me?
And one film.
And one film.
Reversal of fortune, right?
That's right. Called Why Terrorism Works in 2002. And a chapter of that book was based on this very example of the ticking bomb terrorist. And what Dershowitz says is exactly what you said. If we were ever faced with a situation of such a terrorist, there's no question this person would be tortured. So the question then is, what should we do about it? And he thinks that in a democracy, it's very important to be able to publicly justify the actions of government officials. And so what that means is that we must... I'm being lulled to sleep. What that means is that, so are you perhaps by my talking, that means that we must create a law that tells us that we may torture people, but then we must specify the conditions under which that torture must occur. And what he says is that the torture must be non-lethal. He talks about putting a needle under fingernails. Okay? That's not going to kill anybody, but it's sure going to put them in a lot of pain. Or he talks about using a dentist drill and drilling into someone's tooth without anesthesia. That's not going to kill anybody, but it's going to cause a lot of pain. And he says, so we may not kill them, and we can torture only people who are already convicted of terrorism. And furthermore, he has a lot of other restrictions, but he says, furthermore, we must obtain a warrant from a judge, in fact from 2 judges. So it can't be that a police officer who has captured this terrorist gets to decide all by himself whether it's acceptable to torture. And the idea is that what we want to do is we want to prevent the abuse. We want to prevent a slippery slope. We want to prevent the idea that once you begin to allow torture in a state, that torture is going to expand and expand and expand. This is a classic argument against permitting torture, is that once you begin it, you can't stop it, and you're going to be led to a lot of abuse. What Dershowitz says in reply is that when you are dealing with people like this sort of terrorist, there is going to be torture anyway. The best way to prevent the spread of torture is by legalizing it under very narrow circumstances, because once you declare it illegal, what you're going to do is you're going to see the spread of torture, but there will be no democratic accountability associated with that, because the government will say one thing, we are not torturing. It's like what the U.S. government said with regard to all the secret torture facilities that it was running for many years. We said officially we do not torture, but then of course this was happening without any public scrutiny, and the thought was that that is going to lead to more abuses, plus represent hypocrisy. So this is all, we're getting a little off the subject, but this helps because it's a very difficult case for the person who is what I'll call the absolutist. The person who says, if you have a human right, for instance one that Farhad mentioned earlier, right not to be tortured, it seemed to represent the consensus in this group. There's a fundamental human right not to be tortured. If that's true, then the question is it absolute? And it seemed that this group said, yes, it's absolute. But it's an implication of that view that if it's absolute, it's always wrong to torture, even if you think reasonably and credibly that torture is the best way to prevent the loss of many thousands of lives.
I have a word.
Yes. You,
I will
you could
try
take
to
over
urge you,
yeah, okay.
and please tell me in the result, could I convince you or not?
What am I supposed to do?
Okay. The people who try to...
Ethical theory, namely utilitarianism. In fact, it's rule utilitarianism, which says that the way you determine the morality of an action is by asking what is the utility maximizing social policy that will govern this action. And the worry here is this, that once you allow torture, you will open the door to many, many, many cases of impermissible torture. So you might even, I don't know if you're willing to do this, but some people might be willing to say, well, if we actually had this case in which the numbers were not as you think, but as I said, namely that there were many thousands, maybe many tens of thousands of lives at stake, and the only way to save them, we reasonably thought, was to torture someone or to kill an innocent person, then in those circumstances, that would be morally acceptable. But in the real world, if we ever actually tortured such a person, then we would be led inevitably to torturing many, many people like you and me, many people who are completely innocent because of police abuse. That kind of argument, that slippery slope argument, is always based on one thing, and that is a prediction. And so this is, I think, what Sergey was trying to get at when you asked Farhad the question about statistics. The prediction is that something terrible is going to happen in future if we allow this, which may not be terrible, it may not be great, but it may not be terrible. If we allow this right now, something terrible is going to happen in the future. That's a prediction. This argument, the argument of Farhad's, for instance, is only as plausible as the prediction. What someone like Brugge, whom I haven't read, but on the basis of what Slavik has said, or what someone like Dershowitz would say is that if we enact my safeguards, if we enact the procedures that I insist we impose here on torture, then we will have a way of preventing a slide down this slippery slope. The slope is not slippery. We will have a way of preventing ourselves from falling into the terrible situation of having many, many innocent people tortured down the road. Now, Dershowitz is also making a prediction, right? And Brugge, they are also making a prediction. They are saying that we can have enough confidence in our police force and in the rule of law that if we create a law, a set of laws that regulate torture, so that it's conducted only in so that it's allowed only in very narrow circumstances, then we will not have a disaster on our hands, a disaster of human rights violations in our hands. That too is a prediction. But at this point now, it's no longer a philosophical question. Now it's a psychological, sociological, legal question about how much confidence we can have that this society can obey the rule of law in this circumstance, and that we can craft a piece of legislation that restricts torture only to these very narrow circumstances. And because that is not a philosophical question, its answer, after all, may differ from society to society. You may have more confidence, for instance, that Switzerland or the Netherlands can introduce those kinds of laws and stick to them than that the United States could do that. But since it's not a philosophical question, I will feel free to move on. So let's talk about whether human rights are inalienable. And here's what, I don't know the answer to this question. But here's why I'm puzzled to think that they might be inalienable. And that's because there seems to be a kind of paradox in thinking of human rights as inalienable. Because to say that a human right is inalienable is to say that no matter what you do, you cannot lose this right. You can't give it away even if you want to. No matter how hard you try, you cannot give it away. And now, no matter how badly you act, you cannot lose it. You cannot forfeit it. And that seems very puzzling. Think about, what many people regard as a fundamental right, namely a right to at least minimal subsistence. So a right to, what's subsistence?
Поддержание существования.
Okay. So many people think that it's a human right to, that there's a human right to minimal subsistence. Okay. Now, if there were such a right, then we might think it's inalienable. You can never give it away. But what if someone, I'm thinking now of Kafka's story, The Hunger Artist. I don't know if anyone has read that. Someone who deliberately, voluntarily, in effect, gives up his right. People want to feed this man, and he says, no, I'm a hunger artist. I refuse even minimal subsistence. I will go hungry day after day after day, and eventually, well, I won't tell you how the story ends, since it doesn't seem that most of you have recognized the story. But in any event, it seems that when we have, for instance, a right to property, we can give that right up. I have a right to this property, for instance, but I can give it up. Now, what does it mean to say that I have a right to this? It means, in effect, that I have control over this. That's why rights are so important, because they give us control. And this picks up on something that Farhad was very worried about at the end of his last remarks, and that is the expansion of state power over the lives of individuals. One thing that human rights were developed to do is to secure a realm of personal freedom, personal liberty against interference from the state. Okay. So how do they do that? They do that by giving human beings control over their lives, moral control, and hopefully legal control as well. And hopefully you live in a society in which your government recognizes these legal rights and these moral rights. Okay. But if we take the simple example of a right to property, and think about that as a paradigm kind of right, and ask ourselves, what does a right to property really amount to? What does it really mean? What it means is I have control over the object of my right. In this case, my property. So if we have a right to life, what that means is we have control over our own life. But if that's true, then why can't we waive our right and say, my life is no longer worth living. I've committed some incredibly shameful deed, for instance. Or my life is no longer worth living because I have an incurable case of intensely painful cancer. If what a right does is give the right holder control over the right's object, how can any right be inalienable? Because what it is to be inalienable is to remove control from the right holder. You cannot lose it, no matter what you do. That's the paradox. Rights confer control on the right holder, but inalienability removes control from the right holder. And that's why it seems to me to be paradoxical to say that any rights are inalienable. So that's my puzzlement. But I say, I'm not decided on this question. So if someone thinks that there's a good argument, I'm very interested to hear it.
Make a remark.
Yes.
I don't think you lose control when you give up. You may use your right, you may not use your right, but you stay with your right. So you choose to use it or not. You're not losing control. You see?
Well, that is very puzzling to me.
Why is it puzzling?
Because what control amounts to, it seems to me, is a kind of freedom. What control is it's authority. It's power. In this case, it's a moral power. I have the authority to decide what I do with my life, so long as I don't violate other people's rights, of course.
For example, you give up watch, yeah? And after you give up your right to watch, your right of property, you cannot bring it back. But you just can, you have an opportunity not to use your right. But when you change your mind, you can start using it again. So you're not, you just can have a situation where you do not use your right. So to have control and to have a choice to change your decision.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, let's say I decide to give you my watch. Then I have lost my rights. I no longer have a right to the watch.
This is a different situation.
I could try to get it back, but you might say no.
Yes, but I'm not going to involve different situation.
Okay. I'm not sure what the difference is. See, I thought that
you're saying that inalienability means losing control. I'm not sure this is correct.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure this is losing control.
Well,
because when you have rights that you cannot yourself alienate, it just it gives you an opportunity to choose, use your right or not use your right. But when you can alienate, you sometimes there are situations, as you said now, when you can make your mind otherwise. So you see, this gives you a control.
I see. To the extent that if your right is, I understand what you're saying now. Okay, thank you. So if your human right is inalienable, what that means is that you cannot lose it, but that means that you have the right, and if you have the right, then you have control, because rights confer control. I understand. Okay, I understand. But so there's still a paradox, though, it seems to me, and that is that if it's inalienable, I no longer control whether I have this right or not. And if rights are designed to give you that sort of control, there seems to be a puzzle here.
In certain sense, you lose control, but maybe this kind of losing control is better than another kind of losing control.
Well, okay, I can allow that. And then what my question is this. My question then is this: if, as we should grant, I think, that there are some alienable rights, like a right to property, then why are some rights inalienable? For those who think that there are some inalienable rights, which rights are they, and what makes them so special that we cannot lose them, though we can lose other important rights, such as the right to property? Austin?
We know that Rome Empire rights based on Stoic philosophical argumentation, and it seems to me that during 2000 years this question they try to solve in a way of inalienable. For example, yes, I can not change any situation in outside, but I can change my opinion about this situation. That's why I have right to be free in my opinion, in my point of view, but I have no power or right to change any situation outside of me. Of course, it is a little bit mystical, philosophical, and maybe like yoga, but this philosophical question, inalienable or alienable, based on such questions. Where I have absolute freedom, only in my mind, only in my inner life, but not outside, of course. And I can lose any control to my leg, to my hand, but I cannot lose my control to my mind.
That's very interesting. I have two thoughts about that. One is that if that view is correct, then it would make the inalienability of rights depend on a specific philosophy, namely something like Stoic philosophy. Okay? And those who are not attracted to Stoic philosophy would find that argument to that extent weak. Okay? The second point I have is a question to you then. What if I said that what I want to do is I found someone who is willing to pay my family. Let's say I'm very poor, and I can't afford a good life for my family in whatever society I live in. So what I decide to do is I decide to take an offer that someone has made me. What this offer is as follows. The offer says, I will pay you, Russ, $100,000, or rather, I will pay your wife $100,000, and she can raise your family with that money. But what I demand of you, Russ, is I demand to be able to brainwash you. So I'm going to give you some kind of, I don't know, injection, or I'm going to manipulate your mind in some way so that you become my disciple. Now I could not freely convince you to become my disciple, but I'm not that interested in freely convincing you. I just want you to be my disciple. And I will be your guru. Now, would it be acceptable for me to take the money?
Why do you think so?
No.
Why not?
Why not?
It's a good check.
Well, that's the question I'm asking you, right? What you're saying is that because we have control, at least under the Stoic philosophy, only of what is in our mind, what this does is this imposes an inalienable right to we can call, excuse me, just, thank you. What this does is this imposes an inalienable right of freedom of conscience, you could say. Of course, has anyone read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty? Okay, it's a great book. I don't know if it's available in Russian translation or not. Yes, I recommend it. It's a great book for two reasons. It's, in the Western tradition at least, it's the foundation of, it's a foundation of political liberalism. But second, it's very short. I love very short books. So it's only about 60 pages. What Mill does is, when I gave this example, that made me think of an example that John Stuart Mill used of selling yourself into slavery, which is basically the example I used. I just wasn't thinking about it at the time. And what Mill said is that you are not allowed to sell yourself into slavery. We have an inalienable right to personal freedom. Now that right is not unlimited. Of course, we don't have the right to use our freedom to violate other people's rights. So the right is not unlimited, but the right is inalienable. He said, the purpose of having a right to freedom is to protect your freedom. And you cannot use this right to give up all of your freedom, because the very purpose of the right is to protect it. Now, I think myself that's a bad argument. Because the purpose of a right to property is to protect property. But of course we can give up our right to property. And there does not seem to be a paradox there. So I'm not convinced that Mill's argument is very good about that. So I'm not convinced yet that there are any inalienable rights.
May I have one more important argument, I think.
Sure.
You see sometimes there are frequent situations when somebody make you doing something, and you can really prove that somebody made or force you to do that. And so when you legally forbid alienation of rights, so you've protected freedom or protect rights by those procedure, by those statutes. Am I clear?
Yes. Yeah.
So this is a kind of protection.
Inalienability is a kind of protection. Of course, it's a very strong moral protection. It might be a very strong legal protection, but only if the law recognizes that these rights may never be abandoned. But of course, many countries have laws, for instance, in which the right to life is regarded as alienable, because many countries have laws in which executing murderers is acceptable, for instance. So in those cases, the laws do not regard the right to life as inalienable. They regard the right to life as forfeitable. You can, through your bad actions, through certain crimes, alienate your right to life. But the question then is this: since we allow that many rights are alienable, if you think that some rights, some perhaps small number of rights are inalienable, what makes those rights so special? Because all rights are important, right? All legitimate, genuine rights are important, but some legitimate, genuine rights are alienable, such as the right to property. So if there are some rights that are inalienable, we need a special argument for why they have this special status.
We haven't, actually.
What's the argument?
It's a monetary right. The civil law says that if there is a monetary right, okay, if you can value it with a certain amount of the money, it's alienable right. If it's a personal right, it's личностные права. It's
That-
alienable. Okay.
That's not good enough. The fact that this is a right to do with money is not good enough for two reasons. One is that you might say, well, the right to sell my kidney is about money. It's all about money. I wouldn't give my kidney away, but I need to support my family. And the only way I can support my family in this society is by going someplace and selling my kidney for $10,000. And unfortunately, that's the truth in some cases. So this is about money. The second point is that I use the example about the right to property as only one example of many possible examples of alienable rights. So it doesn't have to just be about money. So what we need, again, is a special argument to say that with regard to some few rights, perhaps the right to life, perhaps the right not to be tortured, perhaps the right to freedom of conscience, these can never be lost. You can never give them away, and you can never forfeit them, no matter how badly you act. Even if you are a mass murderer, even if you are a torturer, you cannot lose these rights. Really? Why not? Now, there may be a good answer to that question. It's just a question. But my point is that we need an answer to that question if we are to justifiably defend the idea that human rights are inalienable. Because without an answer to that question, we are left with the default position of thinking that human rights, like most rights, are all alienable. We can lose them. I think one way to interpret your remarks is as a slippery slope concern. The thought is that once we regard human rights, as not absolute and as alienable, then we will lose respect for human rights, and this is going to have terrible consequences. It's a very complicated question. What I would say is that we should distinguish between two questions. One is, what is the truth of the matter? And the other is, how important is it that we publicize the truth of the matter? So it might be that as philosophers, we come up with arguments, we evaluate and criticize the arguments and the positions, and we, not after an hour, but after weeks and weeks together, for instance, we come to the decision that, in fact, human rights are not absolute. They are very important, but they are, in extreme circumstances like the terrorist case, they are not absolute. And suppose that after all this discussion as well, we come to the conclusion that since many rights are alienable, we also have good reason to think that human rights are alienable as well. We can give them away, or we can forfeit them through our wrongdoing. That might be the truth of the matter. And if it is, some truth is not happy truth, right? Some truth is bitter. But if that's the truth, there's a further question. Namely, should we go out and broadcast the truth and tell everybody the truth? And say, you know what? I know you all thought that human rights were inalienable. In one of the founding documents of the U.S., we say that the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness these are inalienable rights. Maybe we should not tell everybody that they are alienable after all. But as philosophers, the first question, the fundamental question is, what is the truth? Sometimes it's not good social policy to broadcast the truth very widely. Okay. Let's talk about the third question. How do we prevent human rights inflation? Here's one way to do this. It was mentioned by a number of people, but one way to do this is to restrict human rights to so-called first-generation rights, the classic rights, almost all of which are negative rights. I had mentioned two ways of distinguishing positive from negative rights yesterday. One is rights that require no action on the part of other people or on the part of the government. And the other is rights that impose a duty not to harm individuals. The thing about negative rights, and most of the first generation human rights are negative rights, such as a right to life, a right to freedom of expression, right to freedom of conscience, a right not to be tortured. These are rights that can be respected by other people if they do nothing at all. So it doesn't take a lot of effort. It doesn't take a lot of social resources. It doesn't take a lot of social capital to honor these rights. So if we were to restrict rights in that way, to human rights in that way, that's a way of preventing rights inflation. But of course, so who was it who said, "What's the matter with inflation?" Was that you, Sergey? Someone came up and said, "Russ, you made a mistake. You were making an assumption here that what we really want to do is we want to prevent human rights inflation." We may not. We may not want to have just 10 human rights. We may want to have 50 human rights. Of course, and then Farhad came up and said, you know what the problem with having 50 human rights is? And that is that once every increase in the list of human rights brings with it an increase in the amount of, in the expense associated with maintaining and respecting those rights. And what happens if a society cannot afford it? Then what? Then, in general, people lose respect for the very idea of human rights because we as a society endorse the idea of this long list of human rights. But if our society is not very wealthy, then we are not in a position to honor all these human rights. And that leads to a lack of respect for human rights. And then we're worse off than when we began. That kind of response is a slippery slope argument. It's based on a prediction, but the prediction I think is reasonable if we think of the longer human rights list as including more positive rights, rights to be benefited in certain ways, because and that's in fact what we see in second and third generation rights, is we see more positive rights on that list, but in order to respect those rights, it's going to cost the society a lot more money. If, for instance, just to take the most infamous example in the UN Declaration of having a right to a paid holiday, that's going to cost the society a huge amount of money, especially if it's got 1 billion people in it. And people will say, well, this is my human right, and the society says, well, look, we actually need this money to spend on education or on basic medical care. So we cannot give you your rights. Then people start to think, well, these rights, maybe they're not so important after all. After all, the government is ignoring these rights. So one way to prevent inflation is that way. In general, there is an argument, and I think we've got 10 minutes, so let's finish up by considering this argument, because it's such an important classic argument against rights inflation. And in fact, it's an argument against the existence of positive rights, which include all rights to welfare. And this argument says, it goes in the following way. If there are positive rights, so rights to welfare, for instance, then they impose duties on the government. They are claim rights, so associated with those claim rights are duties. Since these are positive rights, what the duties that are associated with them are duties to provide aid. They're duties to act in a certain way, namely to provide assistance, help, benefit. Okay. But if a government has a positive duty, a duty to act in such a way as to provide aid, then, and this is a general philosophical principle now, anything that you ought to do, you can do. Anything that you are morally required to do, you can do. This is, in English, this is called the ought implies can principle. Is there such a familiar principle?
Должен значит можешь.
Okay. So this is meant to be a logical principle. Anything that is required it must be possible to do. And this explains, for instance, why if, for instance, imagine that we are in New York City, and we see a skyscraper that's 60 stories tall, so it's say 1,000 meters high, and there's a fire at the top of it. I'm at the bottom, and I see someone yelling at the top, "Help me, help me! I'm going to be burned in the next 20 seconds if you don't save me." If I'm down on the street, I have no obligation. I am not morally required to save that person because I can't climb 1,000 meters in 20 seconds. If I'm in Yaremcha in the winter and it's covered with snow and there's an avalanche, what's the word for avalanche? Okay, if there's an avalanche and I'm with my daughter and she says, "Save me from the avalanche," if all I have are my two hands, I'm morally required to try to save my daughter, but I am not morally required to save her because it's impossible for me to do that. And there are many other examples. I won't multiply examples, but the general idea is clear. You are under a requirement to do something only if you can do it. You are not required to do the impossible. Now, return to our argument. The first premise is, if there are welfare rights, if there are positive rights, human rights, then governments have a duty to provide for them. Second premise, if governments have a duty to provide assistance, the government must be able to provide assistance by means of this logical principle. Whatever you have a duty to do, you must be able to do. But now here's the third premise, and that is, in many cases, for many governments, they are not able to provide all of this assistance. They do not have the necessary resources. And what follows from that? What follows from that fact, that's not a philosophical claim, that's a fact about the resources available to many governments. What follows from that fact, given the first two premises of this argument, is that these governments therefore do not have a duty to provide these resources, and therefore people in their society do not have a right to those resources. That is the classic argument against positive human rights to welfare. Because the idea of a human right is as a universal right, a right had by all human beings in virtue of their humanity. But if some human beings do not have this right, then it cannot be a human right after all. There are three steps to this argument. First, if you have a right to welfare, a positive right to welfare, a positive human right to welfare, then the government has a duty to provide it. Second, if the government has a duty, the government must be able to provide it. Third, some governments cannot provide it. Logically, then, it follows, though I didn't write this down, if you have written it down, you can just follow the logic in your head. Logically, as a matter of pure logic, what follows is that at least some people do not have a right to welfare, to minimal subsistence. And from that it follows that there is no human right to welfare or minimal subsistence, because a human right is had by all humans, not just some humans. That's a very powerful argument. What's the problem with it?
What implies can?
That's the problem?
That's the importance problem.
What's the why is that claim problem? Well, it's problematic because it leads to a problematic conclusion, but it seems to be an excellent principle.
No, I think there is some problem there. For example, a husband has to satisfy his wife, but he cannot do it. I mean, this is not logical. This is fact, and you put it as a logical premise.
Then what the husband, I don't know what you mean by satisfy, but I'll leave that to you.
Economically, emotionally.
Okay.
It's, many.
If the husband, so imagine that he cannot satisfy her in some way.
Economically, for example.
Thank you. Okay, that's economically. She says, "I need a nicer house. I need a nicer house," and he says, "But I'm only a philosopher. I can't give you such a nice house." And then I think what follows from that is that he can legitimately say then, I am not required to satisfy your every need. Or what he should say is, I'm not required to satisfy your every desire. Because I am unable to do this, that means that I am not under an obligation to do it. Let's say his wife wants to live in a castle, and he's a philosopher. And what he can say is, I love you, I want to give you everything you want, but I can't give you what you want in this case. And that lets me off the hook. I think that's right. If he were to say that, he would say, look, I do not have an obligation to give you a castle. And there may be many reasons he has no obligation to give her a castle, but one reason is that he can't. He is just unable to.
But he ought to. She believes.
Well, I think that's what we can say, that it's not the case that he ought to. It would be a nice thing.
She believes.
She believes, but she's mistaken in this case.
She's mistaken.
I mean, not everything we think people ought to do, we're not right about that, right? We can make mistakes about what we believe people ought to do.
That's exactly what happens in human rights scenario. People believe the state has to satisfy certain needs, give
there
money,
we go. Okay.
welfare, but the state cannot do it.
Okay, in that case, it sounds to me that the analysis of the argument I've just given then is this. The argument is correct, but many people do not believe in its conclusion. The conclusion is there is no human right to basic subsistence. Perhaps all of us in this room believe that there is such a right. But what the argument says is we are mistaken. Now, if you want to maintain your belief, in a basic human right to minimal subsistence of health care, of economic well-being, of physical well-being, if you want to believe in that, then you need to show which of these premises, these three premises I gave, are false. Slavic said maybe the ought implies can principle is false. But the example you gave did not persuade me. I'm inclined to say of that example that it's not the case that the husband ought to provide everything the wife wants in this case.
But you can also say that the point is who is implied to ought to.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you just
That
said.
is to say, for example, not this claim for welfare should be addressed not to the state,
I see.
but to the person itself. So he ought to substance himself. Maybe there are cases when he cannot do it.
Right.
He's disabled, for example. Then it's a moral claim that the state obliged to, because state is supported by others' money,
Okay.
and they all live together.
All right. That's a way of criticizing the first premise. What the first premise says, if there is a human right to basic subsistence, to a minimal level of welfare, then the government has a duty to provide it. Many people in the United States will reject that claim because we have many libertarians in the United States, and they think what you just said, namely, it's not that we have a right to subsistence because that would impose a duty on other people, because this would be a claim right. We have no such right. If we want to enjoy a minimal level of subsistence, then we have a duty to ourselves to do it, but other people do not have a duty to us. So that is one way to reject this argument. But it seems to be, it's a very strong position to take. Right? In effect, what you say is we actually no longer have a basic right to subsistence because it's not a right any longer. If it were, we could demand it of others.
Right.
And what you're saying is, no, we can't demand it of others, we can just demand it of ourselves.
Not only of ourselves, but our family, those who support us. So it's like they're really a self-realization right.
Okay, the problem, of course, is that some families are so terribly poor that they will be unable to we will have the same a very similar third premise. Namely, although some governments are too poor to provide these rights, also some families are too poor to provide them, and that will entail that some people do not have these rights. And if some people don't have them, it's not a human right. Let's go have lunch.